In this episode of The Explorationist, we delve into the intricate history of the U.S.-Canada border, focusing on the 49th parallel and the Alaska boundary, lines that have shaped nations and sparked debates. The 49th parallel, stretching approximately 1,270 miles, about 2,044 kilometers, across the western part of North America, serves as a significant portion of the boundary between the United States and Canada. This seemingly straight line was established by the Oregon Treaty of 1846, resolving territorial disputes between Great Britain and the United States. The agreement marked a compromise, with Britain retaining control of Vancouver Island and the United States securing land south of the parallel, including the Oregon Territory. The simplicity of the line belies the geopolitical complexities and negotiations that defined its creation, reflecting a period of intense westward expansion and competition for resources. Surveying this extensive boundary was a monumental task. The Northwest Boundary Survey, conducted between 1857 and 1861, was responsible for marking the 49th parallel on the ground. This endeavor involved teams of astronomers, surveyors, and laborers who braved challenging terrains and harsh climates to demarcate the line. Using tools like sextants, transits, and chronometers, surveyors relied on celestial observations to ensure precision, often facing dense forests, mountain ranges, and rivers that made their work painstakingly slow. The survey not only physically marked the boundary, but also symbolized the cooperation and tensions between two nations with differing visions of the West. East of the 49th parallel, the boundary follows a series of natural landmarks, particularly the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. These features were integral to the Jay Treaty of 1794 and later solidified by the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, which ended the War of 1812. To resolve lingering disputes over specific waterways, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 established clearer lines, particularly around Lake Superior and Lake of the Woods. The boundary here was shaped by economic interests and geography, as both nations sought access to waterways for trade and transportation. This segment of the border is notable for its reliance on existing natural formations rather than artificial lines, contrasting with the straight 49th parallel. In the northeastern United States, the boundary's determination was particularly contentious. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War, initially established vague terms for the boundary between Maine and British-controlled New Brunswick. These ambiguities led to the Aroostook War, a bloodless conflict in the 1830s over the disputed territory. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 ultimately resolved the dispute, defining the boundary along the St. Croix River and a line extending northwest through the forests. The agreement balanced British and American interests, allowing both nations to claim victories while avoiding further escalation. The U.S.-Canada boundary, spanning nearly 5,525 miles, 8,891 kilometers, remains the longest undefended border in the world. Its creation was shaped by treaties, surveys, and negotiations that span nearly a century. From the straightforward 49th parallel to the meandering lines through the Great Lakes and forests of the East, the boundary reflects the evolving relationship between two neighboring nations. It is a testament to diplomacy, compromise, and the enduring impact of historical decisions on modern geography. John H. Clark was a 19th-century American surveyor and civil engineer known for his work on several significant boundary surveys in the United States. His career included involvement in the U.S.-Mexico boundary survey and the demarcation of the 49th parallel between the United States and Canada. However, some of his surveys were later found to contain errors that had lasting implications. In the late 1850s, Clark participated in the U.S.-Mexico boundary survey, which aimed to define the border following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. During this period, he worked under Lieutenant Colonel James D. Graham, contributing to the mapping and documentation of the boundary. Clark's most notable assignment was the survey of the 103rd meridian, intended to establish the boundary between Texas and the New Mexico territory. Unfortunately, Clark's survey placed the 103rd meridian approximately 2.29 miles west of its true location, resulting in a significant territorial discrepancy. This error caused New Mexico to lose about 600,000 acres of its territory to Texas. The mistake was recognized as early as 1882, but was officially confirmed by Congress in 1891. When New Mexico sought statehood in 1910, the acceptance of the erroneous boundary was made a condition for admission, leading to ongoing disputes and dissatisfaction. The New Mexico and Texas boundary was resurveyed in 1912 to address the errors from the original survey conducted by John Henry Clark. The original survey, conducted in the 1850s, had placed the 103rd meridian approximately 2.29 miles west of its true location, resulting in a discrepancy in the boundary between the two states. The 1912 resurvey aimed to correct this mistake and establish a more accurate boundary. The correction, however, did not change the territorial implications, as the error had been accepted earlier in the 1891 legislation. I have actually located the monument near the 103rd meridian and 32nd parallel set by Edward P.S. Robinson in 1912. And it is in very good condition, just not useful anymore. Regarding the 49th parallel, which forms part of the U.S.-Canada border, there is no specific evidence directly linking Clark to errors in its survey. The boundary along the 49th parallel was established by the Oregon Treaty of 1846 and later surveyed by various teams. While surveying techniques of the era were prone to inaccuracies due to the limitations of the equipment and the challenging terrain, attributing specific errors in the 49th parallel survey to Clark would require more detailed historical records. In summary, John H. Clark's surveying career was marked by significant contributions to boundary delineations in the United States. However, his work on the Texas-New Mexico boundary introduced errors that had substantial and lasting impacts on the territorial extents of these regions. While surveying inaccuracies were not uncommon in the 19th century, Clark's mistakes highlight the critical importance of precision in cartography and boundary surveys. John Henry Clark fascinates me. He surveyed several major boundaries in North America, yet his name is repeatedly associated with survey errors that placed borders in the wrong locations. His involvement in these surveys, including those between the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, has left me wondering, were these consistent mistakes due to ineptitude, poor mentoring, inaccurate astronomical methods, or simply a lack of expertise? His name will come up several times throughout this series, as I've made it my mission to uncover the reasons behind these recurring missteps. In fact, I've been reviewing his survey documents, and I am near an opinion on how this may have happened. More on that later. The boundary between Alaska and Canada presents a more complex narrative. Initially defined by the 1825 Anglo-Russian Treaty, the border was described as following a mountain range parallel to the Pacific coast. However, the absence of a continuous mountain chain in certain areas led to ambiguities and confusion about its exact location. Following the United States' purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867, these ambiguities became points of contention, particularly during the Klondike Gold Rush, when access to the region was fiercely contested. The Alaska boundary dispute came to a head in 1903, when an arbitration tribunal largely favored the U.S. interpretation of the boundary, much to Canada's dissatisfaction. Surveying the Alaska-Canada boundary was an arduous task. In 1906, Great Britain and the United States signed a treaty to survey and demarcate the borderline. Surveyors, led by American engineer Thomas Riggs Jr., faced formidable challenges, including dense wilderness, treacherous terrain, and severe weather conditions, in their effort to establish the boundary. The boundary between Alaska and Canada spans approximately 1,538 miles, 2,478 kilometers. This boundary forms part of the international border between the United States and Canada, extending from the westernmost point of Alaska to the Yukon Territory in the east. To give the total length of the U.S.-Canada border, including the Alaska boundary, the overall distance is approximately 5,525 miles, 8,891 kilometers. So, if we break it down, the Alaska-Canada boundary is 2,478 kilometers, and the border along the 49th parallel is 8,891 kilometers for a total of 11,367 kilometers. Reflecting on these historical endeavors, I recall my own experiences surveying in the rugged terrains of Western Canada and beyond. The transition from traditional tools like the transit and rod to advanced technologies such as GPS mirrors the evolution of surveying methods over the centuries. The dedication and resilience of those early surveyors continue to inspire modern explorers and surveyors like myself. In my past life as a seismic surveyor, I had the opportunity to survey near the U.S.-Canada boundary in Alberta and British Columbia. One of the most memorable projects was in 1989, a year that stands out not only for its seismic challenges, but because it was the year I got my first in-vehicle cell phone, necessitated by the fact that I was expecting my second daughter and needed to be ready to race home at a moment's notice. A portion of one of the seismic lines ran along Zero Avenue, where cement monuments are spaced every mile, marked only by a 4-foot-high barbed wire fence in some places and a simple ditch in others. As a surveyor, I used the coordinates from these monuments as reference points in my work. While they weren't always perfectly accurate, they served as reliable markers for the geophysical crews following behind me. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, I often worked with monuments along the border, but nothing quite compared to the wild and remote areas of the Arctic. I also had the opportunity to scout a potential seismic project in the Western Arctic, west of the mouth of the Mackenzie River. I rented a helicopter to get to the site, which was planned to be a marine seismic project extending up to the boundary of Ivavik National Park on the Arctic Ocean. When we left Inuvik, the pilot, who was a rookie, of course, decided to fly along the east shore of the Mackenzie Delta. The clouds were low, so he thought we'd fly above them to check if the weather was better. It wasn't. The helicopter iced up, and the windshield was completely obscured, with no visibility. The pilot made the decision to drop down through the clouds. But we had to be careful because of the trees below. As we descended to around 200 feet, we could finally see where we were. At that point, we opted to fly across the Mackenzie Delta to save time, despite the very real danger. This is not something you want to do lightly. It's only recommended in a twin-engine aircraft in case one engine fails over water. But we were in a single-engine Bell 206. Miraculously, we made it to Whitefish Station, an area known for its whale camps built by the indigenous peoples used for hunting in winter. We landed on the beach for a comfort break, checked out the chopper, and pressed on. The cold that day was biting, and the seawater, mixing salt and fresh water, was folding in waves like slush that almost froze, but couldn't due to the salt. It was a bizarre sight. We continued, passing abandoned dew line stations, which would have made great accommodation for the crew if they were available. Continuing our epic flight, we then flew past the eastern edge of Ivavik National Park and over to Herschel Island, where we circled above a herd of wild oxen. As we approached, the oxen gathered in a protective circle, but we kept our distance, not wanting to add any more stress to the creatures. It must have felt like an alien encounter to them. Since we were in the area and still had fuel, we flew over to the Alaska border. From the wide-open tundra, I could see the big white monuments marking the boundary, standing stark and isolated in the vast expanse. We turned around there and headed back to Inuvik with just enough fuel to make it. It was beautiful, wild and dangerous all at once. A reminder of the raw, untamed nature of the land. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and tell your friends. Join me next time on The Explorationist as we uncover more stories of exploration, boundary making, and the indomitable human spirit that charts the unknown.